Banu. Welcome to my podcast. Thanks so much for being
I'm
here.
so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, no, of course, of course. You were always on my list. It's just one of those things of where we fit everybody in. And you have such a great topic that I can't wait for people to hear about it. So I usually just jump right into the show when we'll start with the first question. And what career did you want to do when you were in grade school, high school, and college?
I was ready for this because I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts and
Great.
I'm always interested to hear the answers to this. So grade school, I don't think I necessarily had a career in mind. I mean, I always loved animals, so I
Hmm.
thought, maybe a veterinarian, but I don't think I was thinking a whole lot about it. And then in high school, definitely super interested in the sciences, was always kind of an ace there. I think I graduated high school with like 7 years of science
Wow.
courses. And I was open minded. I was kind of interested in maybe going into medicine, maybe going into research science, but didn't really feel like I had a strong commitment to anything. Maybe veterinary services was still in there. And then when I went to college, I got a degree in biology. I did all the pre medical studies.
Hmm.
And at the same time, did have some interest in midwifery as well. And after school, I went and worked as a volunteer doula at Long Island College Hospital for a couple months. And I also, in the summers in college, I would work for a pediatrician. I worked for an obstetrician's office to kind of see what is the day to day work like
Yes.
in this profession. Is this something that I will feel like I love my job? I don't need to get away from my job. Like, I don't want to live just for my 2 week vacation.
Hmm.
And I decided it was not for me because I felt that, um, patient autonomy was not always being respected. And I also felt that the medical education was extremely hierarchical, almost militaristic in
Yeah.
terms of like the rankings,
Hmm.
and how residents were treated. And I also felt they had to do things to women without necessarily giving them full information, and it wasn't really the residents choice. Like, they had to just do that. And I also saw when I was a volunteer at Long Island College Hospital that when women came in that were younger, women of color, didn't speak English very well, they were getting a lot of unnecessary procedures, especially if they were alone. And I felt like going through that education, would I be able to be part of that?
Hmm.
I mean, I give you an example. Even I think it was like 2 years ago, they finally passed a law saying, it's amazing they even need a law for this, that you are not allowed as in your medical training to do pelvic exams on patients that are
Yes.
unconscious
Unconscious, going
going
in
in
for
for another
operations.
surgery, right? They're going
Exactly.
in for a knee surgery. And while they're under, without having gotten permission, without having spoken to them before, they have medical students and residents coming through, putting their hands in their vagina to do a pelvic exam to practice, which I don't think that that's necessarily wrong to do that to someone unconscious. I think it's wrong that you haven't spoken to them about it
Before it,
ahead of time and like
exactly.
gotten their permission.
Consent.
And yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I would consider that sexual assault.
That is an assault. It's a
Um,
violation. It says
yeah,
in the patient bill of rights that you have a right to informed consent,
sure,
and they
sure.
weren't informed.
Yeah, so I thought, is that the type of education that I'm willing to go through? And I know there are many incredible doctors out there that, practice in a way that really respects patient autonomy. But it felt like it would be really a struggle for me going through that. And so I looked into becoming a midwife. I did all the prerequisites for midwifery school after college. I got a graduate degree in nutritional science because I got so interested in that,
Hmm.
in doing the prerequisites for midwifery school. And I did a whole nother year of anatomy and physiology after I graduated college at Hunter College. And I started teaching childbirth classes, and I said, okay, I got to make a little money for a little while, and my students would want to hire me to go to their births with them. And after about 3 years of attending births and teaching classes, I was like, oh, I have a career.
Yeah.
Like, I'm here.
Mm-hmm,
Like, I
mm-hmm.
don't necessarily feel, the need to move on. And so now here I am, 15, 16 years later, still very much in the thick of it, and still a very, active labor doula.
When you started teaching childbirth ed, what childbirth ed, like, was it Lamaze or just general childbirth
So
ed?
I was certified through an organization called the Childbirth Education Association of
Mm-hmm.
Metropolitan New York, which is um, a um, a group that was originally founded by women, and particularly one who was worked as an activist in terms of patient rights.
Yes.
And so it's really centered around the idea of information and autonomy, and not necessarily around one specific method or one right way to give birth.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about people being mature adults, and being able to make choices for themselves if they're given like the whole set of information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so now, about a few years ago, you came up with a course on cesarean. Like, what drew you to that?
So this was through the Childbirth
Mm-hmm.
Education Association. They reached out to me. I have been on their board of directors before, and I've always been a part of their education committee. And they reached out to me and said, they have 10 workshops that they offer. That's the education for the new childbirth education candidates. And they reached out to me to teach their workshop on cesarean birth and prevention. And VBAC is included in that. VBAC stands for vaginal birth after cesarean. And so I've been teaching it for, I think this was my 4th year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So what drew you to that initially?
Well, I'm a huge researcher, and I would say I always have researched, methods of cesarean prevention. And so I think I'm pretty good at presenting complicated kind of scientific information in a way that's more digestible.
Mm-hmm.
And so for this particular workshop, I went to work, and I probably did about 40 to 50 hours of research on
Oh,
top of
wow.
kind of my baseline knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
looking at all kinds of different studies, all kinds of hospital initiatives all over the country. There's a 250 page report from the California Maternal Quality Care Collaborative that is about cesarean prevention. And they're doing amazing things. Like, they have like this task force that's going around to different hospitals in California and kind of instituting systemic programs to help, bring the cesarean rates down. And they're being successful with that.
So what are the systems that they put in place to kind of help to bring that down?
There's
Mm-hmm.
different ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as doulas, as childbirth educators, I would say we definitely have these ideas in our mind about what is driving the cesarean rate.
Yes.
We know that this is not a failure of women's bodies or people's bodies to give birth.
Exactly.
And that is evidenced by, Consumer Reports did a kind of an expose on cesarean, where they showed that, your health is kind of the least determinant of whether or not you have a cesarean, that it's much more about where you choose to give birth. And that in the United States, like, we have a tenfold difference in terms of the lowest hospital cesarean rate, which is around 7%, all the way to the highest, which is around 70%.
Oh, wow.
And it is not a difference in populations. It's really a difference in the culture of care at the hospitals. And so as doulas and childbirth educators, we sometimes have ideas about, what is driving this rate? We say, okay, is it the hospital setting up systems where they know with a cesarean, it's 1 hour in the operating room, it's scheduled, they can make, triple or quadruple the amount of money with a scheduled event rather than, when somebody's going to go into labor, nobody knows. How long it's going to take, nobody knows. So they can have less staff over a shorter period. And, then the person is going to stay there 3 days postpartum, that ends up earning the hospital a lot more money too. So is there a financial push here that's leading to this higher cesarean rate? There's also the perception that maybe doctors, they just don't trust women's bodies to do this, that there's a sense of a cesarean being such a controlled event, whereas birth is very unpredictable. And does that drive the cesarean rate? Well, it turns out there's a lot of research to support these general ideas, and that in some of the hospitals in California where they've changed the pay structure so that instead of paying doctors by what procedures they do during each shift, how many cesareans, how many vaginal births, they're doing an average. So whatever shift you worked, we're looking at what happened on the labor and delivery floor during that shift, how many cesareans, how many vaginal births, and we're going to take an average amount of payment over that, and we're going to pay everybody equally. And what they find is that in a few months, that brings the cesarean rate down significantly.
Oh, wow.
Laborist models in hospitals also have tremendous success. And this basically means the doctor does not have to be there through the entire labor. And just to, kind of be on the doctor's sides a little bit, like obstetrics is an extremely challenging field of medicine.
Definitely.
To be someone who is, has a day of scheduled surgeries, whether that's gynecological surgeries or scheduled cesareans for good reasons. And then also to potentially be on call so that you're, up all night with a labor that sometimes takes 36 hours. I mean, sometimes labors are healthy and normal and really long. That is very challenging. And so to have a model where the obstetrician has support so that they are coming towards the end of labor, they're helping to manage labor over the phone, and you have someone that's an expert, not just a labor and delivery nurse, as wonderful as they are, do not necessarily have the additional training to completely manage the labor. Although some of the ones that have been doing this for 20 years, I don't know, I feel like they should kind of have an honorary degree at this point. But a midwife or, another doctor who's kind of there on call could watch that normal labor as it goes. And then the doctor functions more as a consultant. And we know this model works all over the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, in most of the world, everyone has a midwife. And then you have an obstetrician, often called a consultant, if there's something that's going on that's a little bit more high risk. And it results in greater patient satisfaction, birth that's less expensive, less procedures, less interventions, and a lower cesarean rate and healthier outcomes. So we have a model that works. It's just that we're not generally implementing it here. But when hospitals have made simple changes, such as, okay, here's I'm forgetting the name of what they call this, a bundle. Okay. So it's kind of like a clinical bundle of care. So one bundle, for example, would be if a patient's water is not broken, we don't admit them to the hospital before about 4 centimeters, or the labor is kind of getting active. Okay. So that would be one. And then we have employ laborists, like more midwives and more people to kind of stay at the hospital through the labor. And just that 2-point bundle has been shown to drop the cesarean rate dramatically in a hospital system. So there are known ways to do this. It's just not necessarily being implemented more widely, despite the fact that both ACOG, the American Congress of OBGYN, and the World Health Organization believe that the cesarean rate should be below 15%.
And is there in your studies, in your research, was there any plan of bringing this these systems around like nationally, or is it just?
There's not a coordinated national effort.
Yeah.
But there is an effort within the American College of Nurse Midwives. Like they started a preliminary project in 2016. And I think now they have somewhere around 17 hospitals involved in this. And then California is kind of a nation in of itself in terms of how large it is, the population, the economy, etc. And so in California, there's kind of a statewide initiative in this, and they have actually made tremendous strides. I mean, not just in these hospital initiatives for cesarean prevention, but California has dropped its maternal mortality rate dramatically.
Wow.
For your listeners that are not aware, the United States has a very high maternal mortality and fetal mortality rate for an industrialized nation. They rank about 45th globally in terms of their outcome statistics. And California, has changed that. So if you pull out that state on its own, its statistics are much, much better. One sad fact, however, is that although their overall maternal mortality across all races is much lower than the national average, the disparity for Black women still remains about 3 times as high. Even though, their maternal mortality might be a third of the overall nation, or for Black women nationally, it might be a third for Black women in California, it's still 3 times as high as for white women. So somehow that disparity is still existing, even though it's coming down for all groups. And we also see this in terms of cesarean rates. Cesarean rates have leveled out pretty much since 2009. Like they really climbed through the 90s and the early 2000s and kind of topped out around 32%, which is close to where they are now. They're a little bit lower, but they've kind of leveled out now. However, for Black women, they're still around 35%. So they're still significantly higher. And that, just like with maternal mortality, that does not seem to be accounted for by just Black women having worse health going into labor. It really seems like it's more a culture of racism, or a culture of, feeling more comfortable doing a surgery on someone. Or one woman that I was speaking to about this said that, within a group of Black women that she was speaking to, she even wonders, and again, this is just speculation, if she even wonders if perhaps it's a way of discouraging some Black women from having more children. That, if they've had 3 cesareans and doctors are telling them you should not be having any more children. I thought that was a very, dark thought, but I would not necessarily rule that out.
No, I know of a childhood friend who got pregnant later in life and had twins, and they gave her a hysterectomy and didn't tell her why.
Oh my God.
After she had her twins, she had no idea why they gave her a hysterectomy. And those are the type of stories that we hear constantly.
Well, didn't that big expose just come out about the immigrant women in the detention center, that they were doing hysterectomies on them right and left? So this is not, it's a dark, dark thought. And we don't like to think this is a possibility, but there's, the history of reproductive care and gynecological care for Black women certainly does not rule out that possibility.
Yeah. And as far as can you speak a little bit to the surgery? Like, what does the surgery entail? Why, as doulas, we always hear our clients say, I don't want a C-section. Right. And then there are other clients who opt in. So could you explain a little bit?
Yeah. And again, I think, both with doctors and patients, there can be a perception that the surgery, gives control. One of the studies that I looked at, I think it was 30% of the doctors said that they view a cesarean birth as one that has greater control and is more predictable. And that's unfortunate, because when you're talking about risks, a cesarean has far greater risks than a vaginal birth. Even a non-emergency scheduled cesarean, the infant has about double the chance of going to the neonatal intensive care unit right after the birth than they do with a vaginal birth. So this perception that a cesarean is just, let's sacrifice the mother's body to make the birth so safe for the baby. That is not actually true. Cesarean has significant risk for the baby too. About 1 in 100 babies is cut during the procedure. It is a very common event for there to be delayed lactogenesis after a cesarean, meaning that the breast milk turns from that buttery colostrum to the more voluminous white milk later, maybe on day 5 or 6. And that, of course, has risk for the baby in terms of how they're fed and what their weight loss might be in the beginning. We do know that the microbial flora for a baby born by cesarean is more similar to operating room flora than the healthy, normal microbiome that they would receive through a vaginal birth. And it's postulated that perhaps that's why babies born by cesarean have higher rates of asthma, eczema, other autoimmune conditions, and higher rates of obesity, even that perhaps that's related to their flora and how they're colonized. Of course, breast milk is tremendously restabilizing for that. And for the mother, of course, it's the major risks of surgery, major abdominal surgery. So bleeding or hemorrhaging, is a huge part of that. The blood loss from a cesarean birth that is considered normal blood loss would be about double what would be considered normal blood loss for a vaginal birth, or kind of not normal, but the borderline for what would be considered hemorrhaging. The borderline is, twice as big with a cesarean birth. And of course, it's a longer recovery period. And I don't know where I read this, but I remember somebody phrased this in a way that I thought was just so fitting, that anytime you go to the hospital and you have a major surgery, you go back home and you have a primary caregiver taking care of you. And you have a few days of just sleeping a whole lot and being taken care of and fed and recovering. And here is where we have a major abdominal surgery and we go home to be the primary caregiver of somebody else. And that is, just tremendously challenging. And I do also think sometimes doctors have this perception of a cesarean birth. And I was really disappointed recently at a birth that I was at, where the doctor, in convincing this mom that a cesarean might be necessary, started bringing up, her vaginal integrity.
Oh my God, that's so disgusting.
Gonna save your vagina. And that concept of the pelvic floor muscles and that somehow you're going to be saved. There's no long-term research that shows any greater rates of, incontinence for vaginal birth versus cesarean birth. And we know that with a cesarean birth, let's talk about the surgical procedure here. You're cutting through, nerves that are along what's called the nipple line in the body, and where, there is a sexual kind of component here, a sexual connection here in terms of this nerve transmission, to parts of your body that are, responsible for your sexual response. So we're cutting through there. A lot of people have, tremendous numbness around where that incision is after a cesarean. And sometimes the nerves regenerate, but sometimes that takes years. And then the skin is cut through the fascia layer, and then the abdominals, are separated, down the middle. The flap that attaches the bladder. I know a lot of this might be very triggering for people who have
I'll put a disclaimer in the beginning.
That sometimes have not necessarily, known the details of what happened. The bladder flap, which attaches the bladder to the uterus, is cut, and the bladder is pushed down out of the way. And then the 4-inch incision is made on the uterus. And the baby is brought through that incision. And then the placenta, rather than, the blood, that the newborn blood that still remains in the placenta and the cord now draining into the newborn, as is most common with a
Vaginal
vaginal
birth.
birth. Hopefully, that's 2 or 3 minutes at least of the blood, going into the baby so that the baby has its full blood volume. Most surgeons are not comfortable with waiting that time. Some
No.
surgeons are comfortable waiting a minute or two, but most are not. So the cord is clamped immediately. And so therefore the baby doesn't have its full blood volume. And then the placenta is not having kind of a natural delivery, meaning that the blood is draining into the baby, which then closes off that capillary bed, and helps the placenta detach, so that closing off of that vascular bed that prevents bleeding is done in a physiological way. Instead, the surgeon puts their hand in and scoops out the placenta manually. And so that has potentially more risks of bleeding postpartum or after the birth as well. And so then the baby's out. So all of that takes about 10 minutes. Usually it's done with epidural anesthesia or a spinal anesthesia, which means the mom is usually alert and awake for this experience. Some people have named a cesarean surgery that really supports the family bonding and connection and it as a birth experience, have named it the gentle cesarean. And I just feel like it's the worst name, because there is nothing about this that feels gentle to the one that's experiencing it. Like when the baby is brought out, there's usually assistants to the surgeon that are pressing down on the abdomen, to help the baby come out. And a lot of women describe that as like feeling like an elephant stepped on my chest.
A lot of pressure and tugging and pulling, and no conversation around these are the things that would happen or you would feel prior to. So when they're happening sometimes, and their arms are strapped down, right?
Yes. I mean, your arms can be strapped down. They can just be at the side unstrapped. So you can ask them to have them unstrapped. And that I would say, using that terminology of gentle, most women throw up during it. They feel, they feel nausea. They feel all this tugging and pulling. It's a surreal experience. Your heart is racing. Like,
very disorienting.
It's a lot. It's a lot. The room is very bright. The room is very cold. There's a lot of people in the room. They're all kind of moving around, but nobody's really talking to you and connecting with you. There is an anesthesiologist that's kind of over your shoulder, and they will answer questions and things like that, but nobody is right there with you describing what's going to happen, that this is normal, and kind of supporting you through it. So I do think it's a really unfortunate thing that most hospitals do not allow doulas.
Yes, I agree.
In the operating room, because the few times that I have been in the operating room and I have supported women through my patients through cesarean, I kind of wonder, like, how do they get through this without me here? Because I am really intensely working that entire time, like right there with them, talking them through the whole thing, keeping them calm. Like, often when the baby comes out, their partner wants to kind of go to the baby and hold the baby and bring the baby to them. And I'm like, who would be,
there
with
her
when that's going on? So I think it's really unfortunate that hospitals are doing that. And I don't think it would be, having been in there a few times, I don't think it would be disruptive.
No, I don't. I mean, I know there's one doctor who that we both know, and who I got into the OR at Mount Sinai East, and she told me a story right before we went in, and I had to remind her, like, who I was. Like, I've been doing this for 17 years. Like, we're good. She was like, the doula got up and walked around the OR.
Right.
And I was like, well, yeah, that's not what the majority of doulas will do in the OR. And maybe there should be some kind of training in hospitals that are letting doulas into the OR with an understanding of, when you go in, this is your role. You have to sit there and coach. You stay in this seat.
Right here, right? If they can educate the partners to do that within a 2-minute period.
Yep.
Like, why can't they explain to the doula to do that within a 2-minute period?
Exactly.
I think that would be highly unusual that a
Exactly.
doula would get up. And interestingly enough, when I was a volunteer doula at Long Island College Hospital, I had no specific special training. Like, I was just there helping people. I was invited into the OR all the time.
Wow.
So it was really interesting that, like, I guess because I was somehow part of the hospital,
Yeah.
rather than, I could hang out at the nurses station. I overheard all kinds of interesting conversations that really gave
Yeah.
me an education of what's going on behind the scenes in a labor and delivery floor.
Yeah.
So coming back, okay, so the baby is out.
Yes.
And then the team is closing the mother back up. And so that includes many layers. And this is where I've spoken to, a few in researching this workshop. I reached out to some surgeons, some obstetricians that I know well, and asked them more about what is the surgical technique. And what I discovered is that through the 90s, the surgery started becoming much faster. And that probably related to the fact that the cesarean rate was getting really high.
Yeah.
And most of these hospitals, they want to clear the ORs quickly. Most hospitals, these major urban hospitals in New York City, obviously it might be very different when you're dealing with smaller hospitals, but these are all very big hospitals. They usually have 3 operating rooms for labor and delivery for cesareans. And they try to leave one room empty all the time, so that basically if there's something very urgent that happens, there's an open OR. So what this means is that you have these 2 ORs going, and one of them has to clear before you can put in another person for something like a failure, the labor's not moving fast enough, or it's a scheduled surgery, or something like that. And so there's this incentive, to save 5 minutes here, to save 3 minutes there. And so the way that the surgical technique started being done was much faster. And so this means that they're closing generally 3 layers instead of 6 layers. Most surgeons are not putting stitches to reconnect the abdominals. They're not putting stitches to reconnect the bladder flap. And so your bladder is not necessarily going to be reconnected to go where it was supposed to go. Like, the layers aren't being closed so that the loose ends can end up healing to something that they're not necessarily supposed to heal to, like your intestines or, something else. And that's why we see that, a cesarean in general is a fairly safe operation as operations go. I don't want to make it seem, like this is an extremely scary thing. When we're comparing it to vaginal birth, yes, there are significantly more risks with a cesarean birth, but a vaginal birth is not a procedure.
Yes.
This is just a normal event, a normal healthy, capacity of a person's body. And certainly as a major surgery, barring something really going wrong, is much more dangerous than that. But when we're comparing cesarean surgery to many other surgeries that people have, it is like a stomach surgery or a lung surgery or heart, like it is a very safe surgery compared to that. That can start changing as you're going into a 3rd cesarean, as you're going into a 4th cesarean. And that has a lot to do, with adhesions. Like often there needs to be a general surgeon in addition to the obstetrician, that's there to kind of handle anything that is abnormal or found that, the bladder flap, maybe that adhered to something else. Maybe there's intestinal adhesions, there can be all kinds of things going on that now makes it a longer procedure with a greater risk of bleeding and more complications. We also know that, a cesarean can lead to a lot of complications in your next pregnancy or your 3rd pregnancy, that things like, the placenta peeling off of the wall of the uterus, like abruption, is more
Yes.
common if you've had a previous cesarean. The risk of the placenta growing through the scar into the abdominal wall, which is an
Accretia. Yeah.
incredibly dangerous thing. It's called accreta.
Mm-hmm.
When a few years ago I went to the New Jersey Symposium on cesarean prevention, and there was a very kind of fireball dynamic nurse there that had been a nurse in L&D for over 30 years, and she was kind of taking it on to bring the cesarean rate down at her hospital. I was really impressed with her, and she had been like publishing each doctor's cesarean rates,
Oh,
like
wow.
in the hallway. And like first she said she did it anonymously, and like found it very humorous that some doctors were looking at this list like, oh, who's this guy with this really high rate? And it turned out it was him. But that some doctors are not even really aware. They're not even keeping those statistics to really know what their own rate is. But she said when she first started 30 years ago, accreta was, learning about it was kind of like an academic exercise that, you know, she didn't expect to ever see an accreta in her lifetime. It was just like, this thing exists. And she said now they're like seeing that every month at the hospital that she works at. Yeah. And so that, you know, again, the risks really get larger as time goes along. While a first cesarean is generally a very safe surgery, a fourth, you know, cesarean or a third cesarean may not be. And so having a surgeon, you know, that maybe closes all those layers might make a difference. I even found research showing that the staples that they use at the skin incision to close the skin incision, they now use metal staples going across rather than sutures. And that you're more likely to be readmitted to the hospital with staples. You're more likely to have the incision open up than with the sutures, and that the sutures do take, you know, maybe 5 minutes longer than doing the staples, even though, you know, the outcomes are not as good. Yeah. So in terms of, you know, the making the surgery a little better, again, I don't call it a gentle cesarean. I think of it more as like a family-centered cesarean. A lot of that has to do with the support that the patient receives, like having things explained, slowing it down, honoring it as a birth instead of just a procedure, lifting the baby up, maybe having a clear drape so she can see her baby just born. Some of my clients that have had cesareans, the photographs they can get of that baby as it's just lifted up and, you know, it's spread out and like, it's just that raw moment that you're never going to get to have that moment again. Like they're dramatic and beautiful. And for the family, you know, to still get to experience the birth aspect of the surgery, I think is tremendous for them, so that their memories of the surgery are not just around, you know, I felt alone, even though there were people there. I felt all these sensations. I didn't know if it was okay. I was really scared. Everyone was talking about other stuff. I felt like I was not even a body. It was just like, you know, I'm over here and then all these things are happening to me that I'm not even a part of, like, as opposed to everyone focusing their language around the birth. You know, okay, we're going to start. You're going to be seeing your baby really soon. Everything's going really well. Yeah, that's normal what you're feeling. And okay, we're going to start. The head is out. We're going to give it a little pause. And here comes your baby. Here she is. And, you know, and having that be a greater part of their memory of the experience. And then, of course, if the baby is healthy, having the baby stay in the operating room, having the baby draped over the partner, the photographs, you know, having as much of the birth aspect of the experience as is possible, and then having extra support, you know, in the recovery room immediately after the birth to do skin to skin with the baby, maybe putting the heart monitor leads on the back so that her chest is clear for skin to skin contact, for cuddling, for breastfeeding. Sometimes it's very difficult for the patient to even sit up right after the birth. So it's really important for breastfeeding support to be a more integral part of the recovery room. And
Yeah.
I don't see that happening. I see that. And it is not a fault of the nurses,
No.
because when you have somebody coming out of the operating room, your priority is, you've got a healthy baby, the
Yes.
baby's doing okay. Your priority is making sure that this person is not bleeding too much,
Mm-hmm.
their heart rate is good, their blood pressure is
Yes.
good, that their body is stabilized. And you've got three other people in there,
Mm-hmm.
or two other people in there
Yeah.
that you also have to make sure that's happening for. So how are you supposed to now spend 30 minutes, saying, oh, look at your baby starting to
Yes.
root. They're starting to,
Exactly.
let me see if I can help them latch, and
Yeah.
really helping this person. That it's an impossibility to
Yeah.
ask that from the nurses. So I wish that they just had a lactation person assigned to the recovery room
Yeah, that would be
after
helpful as well.
cesarean that could go, doesn't even necessarily need to be an IBCLC or,
No.
the highest credential. It could be a lactation counselor. It could
Mm-hmm.
be a postpartum nurse that has the
Yeah.
CLC credential that's now just assigned, to the recovery room,
Yeah.
because that is tremendously needed in that recovery room. I wish that they would set up that system.
Yeah, sometimes I've been able to have nurses when they can, like we ask if we can get skin to skin in the OR, and a couple of
Right.
them have been able to do that. Or
Right.
sometimes they come out and the baby's already nursing because they had the skin to skin in the OR, which is
Yeah.
great when we can
Yeah.
get it. But I tell them that's not something that they should expect right away because for that same reason, that nurse's responsibilities are heightened. She has so much to do when she gets out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what do you find after doing all of this research and teaching this course is like the best avenue for your clients to take in preventing the first cesarean?
Yeah, I tell them to show their doctors that they're educated.
Mm-hmm.
Again, from my very first experiences as a volunteer doula all the way through until now, patients that are highly educated and show their doctors that they're thinking, and that they're reading and they're researching. I think doctors are going to be less likely to kind of suggest flippant, kind of cesareans when they
Yes.
know somebody has a strong commitment to a vaginal birth, and they're going to be asking a lot of questions. There is a summary from Choices in Childbirth, that um, summarizes the 2014 paper by ACOG and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine on preventing the primary cesarean, that talks about what doctors' guidelines should be around cesarean. Things such as, if the baby is breech, offer a version to
Version.
try to
Mm-hmm.
turn the baby. If they're twins, intend to have a vaginal birth.
Yeah.
If it's failure to progress, we need to see at least these parameters before we're saying it's too slow. So having a rough idea of those guidelines that your doctor should be following, and maybe
Is
even
helpful.
taking that summary
Mm-hmm.
into a prenatal visit, or asking your doctor, what practices are you employing in your practice to try to bring your cesarean rate lower?
Yeah.
What have you found really works? Talking to them about the pushing stage. What are some strategies that you use to try to ensure, a lower cesarean rate? One hospital started in California, started instituting a requirement that each cesarean required a second opinion in real time from another attending doctor that was in L&D then. And they found that this really helped. The old procedure at that hospital was that they would review cesarean cases. Like at the end of the week,
Yes.
they would all sit down together and say, was this needed or was that needed? And like that brought the cesarean rate down a little bit. But the real time in the moment second opinion was much more effective, because in that case, like, how many other patients the doctor has, how many, how
Yeah.
long they've been, like, it's more like, is this really about medical care, or is this a human being, that's trying to do their best,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe has been up for 25 hours and has three other patients they're also trying to take care of, and maybe their brain is not quite working at the top level for this individual patient. I mean, you can't always be perfect, and having that second opinion there two brains are better than one. So
Yeah.
why not? Right.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing about this a long time ago when my aunt, who had her first baby at the Elizabeth Seton Childbearing Center,
Oh, yeah.
which, has since closed. Interestingly enough, this year, 2020,
Wow.
is the year that we finally had a childbirth center open in Manhattan,
Mm-hmm.
even though, Elizabeth
Yeah.
Seton closed probably 20 years ago. I'm not even
Actually, it
sure.
closed. I was a doula. It closed like the year after. So
So
year or
maybe like
two,
17 years
yeah,
ago or something
17,
like
16
that.
years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
did all my courses for childbirth education at Elizabeth Seton. That was like
It's a great place.
my first
Yeah.
introduction. So my aunt was pushing at Elizabeth Seton, and it was taking really long, and she ended up transferring to Lenox Hill Hospital,
Mm.
and who, interestingly enough, was a backup back then. Elizabeth Seton was
Oh,
actually in a
wow.
different location. So this is like 40 something years ago.
Okay.
And her husband was, about 15 years older than her, this very kind of buttoned up, very distinguished Black gentleman. And he had taken the childbirth class with her at Elizabeth Seton, and he really took in this concept of patient autonomy. And when they went to Lenox Hill, and the doctor right away was saying, "You need a cesarean. There's no way you're getting this baby out." And he said, "We would like a second opinion on that." And another doctor came in and said, "I think you can have this baby vaginally. Like, let's try it." And it was an assisted delivery. It was a forceps delivery, but she had her 10-pound, first baby, my
Yeah.
cousin, who's now like 6'4". And I knew that story from when I was, a teenager, and I first started hearing about the family birth. So it's funny that now here I am all these years later, and hospitals are just figuring out what my uncle knew
Exactly.
way
Exactly.
back
For them.
then, like
Get
get
a
a
second
second
opinion.
opinion.
Exactly.
And that, it helps in those tricky situations where doctors are overburdened and just, trying to do their best. And what they found, interestingly enough, is that the vast majority of time, the second opinion agreed with the first.
Oh.
But that the first doctor was much more careful about recommending a cesarean when they knew that they would need that second opinion confirming it right afterwards. So I've started adding, to my sample birth preferences, like under the cesarean section, we would like to have a second opinion. And maybe it's just as important that your doctor kind of thinks you're going to want a second opinion, that you're actually getting it in the moment.
Exactly.
And then a lot of the strategies around cesarean prevention, I think it's important if you're working with a doula, or you can even just look up a lot of this stuff online, like, staying home until active labor, like those same things that some hospitals have instituted, like we don't admit, patients until they're 4 centimeters if their water bag is intact, or, we're waiting for active labor. So if your hospital is saying, if you'd like to go back home, we think it would be okay. Like, don't worry about the cab ride. Like, it's probably the right call, even if you're just going back home for 3 or 4 hours. Staying upright and mobile, being very vocal about your needs, whether they're emotional needs or physical needs, like being a very active participant. And if you have a partner, to really let them be part of all the education and part of this, so that they're on board and they can be speaking up for you when perhaps you're not, as able to, or don't quite have the energy to. So we know that support people decrease the cesarean rate, even if they're not a professional. If you have a professional support person, I mean, doulas are the answer to a lot of this. They're going to drop your cesarean rate by 30 to 50%, depending on the research that you're looking at. And that's partly because they're going to help you employ all of those other strategies of like asking all the questions, communicating with your care providers, staying home until active labor. All of those things doulas are going to help you with. And then I think you'll have to cut there. I'm forgetting.
Okay, no worries. You were saying all of the implementations that the hospitals had taken in to prevent cesarean.
So you're kind of taking, you're taking those onto yourself. If you're at a hospital that isn't necessarily using those strategies, you can think about using them on your own, like asking for a second opinion, like, staying home until active labor, all of those sorts of things. And then, of course, the final answer, which we kind of know is the answer to the most of the issues in the maternity care system, which is just the midwifery model of care.
Yes.
Like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel,
No, we
people.
don't. We don't.
We really just need to,
We need more
support
midwives. Yeah.
the education of a mass force of midwives. And what I'm really hoping is that the obstetric community can get on board with this, realizing that many obstetricians get into the field because, well, they are surgeons.
Yes.
And thank goodness we have people who want to be surgeons,
Yes,
because
yeah.
that is a challenging profession. And wouldn't it be wonderful if they could focus on that and focus on the high risk cases and learn to do vaginal breech deliveries and versions and twins and become real experts on forceps and vacuums, because they are doing those things way more often because they're not sitting around monitoring regular labor.
Yes.
So it's a doctor, 2 doctors working with a practice of 5 midwives, and they're only doing this stuff in the practice for a much larger group of patients that require, that level of procedural expertise.
Yes.
And then you have the midwives that are really there, caring for those women throughout. And I also think one of the big issues in obstetrics, and in the way that they practice, and there have been studies that have done like anonymous surveys of doctors and their perceptions, and over 50% of them will say that litigation and the fear of litigation drives the way that they practice.
Exactly.
And we know that midwives have much lower rates.
Yeah.
Of being sued than doctors do, and partly it's because of building the personal connection with their patients and informing their patients more thoroughly and allowing those patients to make an autonomous decision and not pressuring them in where they're saying there is this risk, but here's all the information. I'm not perfect. I don't know exactly what the right answer is. This is my best, experience and research-based recommendation for what we should do here. But I can't make a guarantee. And having that type of longer conversation leads to patients that are not necessarily going to be angry when the risk did show up.
Yeah.
Versus saying, do what I say and I can guarantee a safe baby.
Exactly.
Which you just cannot do. And so, perhaps in a couple doctors working in a practice with 5 midwives, their litigation rates are going to go way down. Yeah. They're going to have less time on call, less time sitting around for normal, healthy labors, more, procedures, because they're doing it for a larger group of patients, for a bigger practice, get paid as well. Like I wish that OBs would embrace, this model instead of seeing midwives as something that competes with them.
Yeah, that is so true. It is fascinating. Thank you so much for, your research and sharing that with us. When are you teaching this course again?
So I only teach it once a year.
Okay.
Although I am open. I have kind of one version that I've created for the Childbirth Education Association. And then I do have kind of another version that's for a more general population. So I have toyed around with perhaps just teaching it as a continuing education for doulas.
I think that would be great.
I may offer it,
especially now,
kind of a couple times a year.
As online, everyone's online. I think
exactly.
That would be great.
Yeah, this was my first time teaching it on Zoom, and I found it worked really well, like better than I expected.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. The next segment that I'm going to jump right into is daily inspiration. And that's what I like to call it. Yeah. I'm always writing quotes on the internet and stuff. So what brings you joy?
definitely newborns bring me joy.
Mm,
That moment right after the birth, however the birth happens, I think seeing the parents meeting their child
yeah,
is never gets old.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
it really is the most special moment
I
in
agree.
many people's lives. And
Hmm.
so that brings me tremendous joy. Um, when timings all work out in
Yes.
life.
As a doula, that is like the biggest stressor of this. I have someone who's going to be induced this week, and then
Right,
I have
right.
someone who's thinking she's in labor at the
Yeah.
same time. Yeah, that is
And
the
it's
biggest
not just
stressor.
that. I mean, I would say even in my personal life, like just timing
Time.
of things
Yes.
working out,
Yeah. Yeah.
always gives me great pleasure. And then I have a pretty serious hobby. Like before um I became a doula, I worked on a horse farm for a few years and was a
Mm-hmm.
professional horse trainer. And
Mm-hmm.
so I still ride, as a pretty serious hobby.
Yeah.
And I would say, body language, with physical communication with a horse,
Yeah.
like, the
Nonverbal
horse kind of
communication right
exactly
there.
like
That's,
is,
mm-hmm.
although I chatter to them
Yes.
too,
Yeah.
but it's really cool to be able to like read somebody else and read that.
Yep.
And I feel like I use those skills all the
All the,
time in
mm-hmm.
birth too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. That
When,
primal,
yeah.
primal communication.
I've always wanted to learn how to ride a horse properly. When I was in grade school in Panama, I remember I was changing for gym one time with a friend, and she had this huge bite mark on her arm. And
Oh boy.
I was like, what's that? And she was like, oh, the horse. And I was like,
The horse
horse?
probably
The
lifted her
horse,
up.
yep, the horse bit her. And I said, they bite you? And I was done. I was like,
Yeah.
that's it. I don't want to learn anymore. I was like, I'm good. I had
Well,
no clue.
that's where you know the horse.
Yeah.
I have never been bitten by a horse, and I've worked around horses since I was 13
Yeah.
years old. Like, again, I know how to read them, but it's
Hmm.
I could have been bitten.
Yeah.
But also, you know which horse you're dealing with.
Exactly. And
And
she
somebody who
said
is
that.
novice,
Yeah, she
who is
said
just
that.
learning, you are going to match them just like with a dog,
Hmm.
right? Like some dogs are aggressive and require, a trainer that knows what they're doing. And there's other dogs that like you can put with a 1 year old baby poking their eyes and pulling their tail,
Yeah.
and they
And
are not going to do
they do
anything,
nothing.
right? So
Exactly.
you match the beginner with the
Yes.
very kind
Gentle.
horse. Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. What's your favorite scent?
I love geranium.
Mmm.
Yeah.
That's a nice one. We've never had that one
Yeah.
on the show.
And gardenia. I
Gardenia.
love
Yeah, I
gardenia.
haven't had that one. I like gardenia. I like
Yeah.
gardenia as well.
I bought a gardenia plant and like I'm hoping it flowers, but it has not. I'm like I'm waiting for my smelly
No,
flowers.
no. Oh, you have to. You know the thing about flowering plants is that you have to feed them. Like
Okay.
every month, you have to feed them. I'm gonna
Yeah.
send you a link for this
I've been
super
feeding
grower.
it. I got the
But
organic
yes,
fish,
yeah,
juice, and I've been
and
feeding it. And
yeah, and then
I
but
think maybe it's not the season,
you have to stress them too. Like they don't
Okay.
grow because they're happy. They grow
Yeah.
when you stress them out. Like that.
Okay.
Then they're like orchids in the same way. You have to stress them out for them to like
Okay. I
reflower.
don't have luck with orchids. As
Yeah,
you can see, I have a lot of plants.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
this,
Orchids their own the orchids are like babies. You have
yeah.
a lot of care. And
Yeah.
I used to have a whole bunch of orchids before I had my son because I had
Okay.
the time to like once a
Yeah.
month give them a bath, do all of these things for them, and they used to flower all the time. They liked the sunlight. I had the east sun. It was great. But yeah, they're their own beast. What's a quote or saying that inspires you?
Um, I don't know if it inspires me so much, but it is one I think about often, which is, and I'm an atheist. I'm not a big believer, but if you want to make God laugh, make a plan.
Yeah.
But just, this
Yeah.
idea that we can orchestrate our whole
Yes.
lives. Like I really, I like the idea of and I am a planner. I am an organizer. I'm,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I'm a very organized person, but at the same time, I know if you're too organized and you plan too much, you're not open
No.
to when these opportunities, and these connections come your way.
Yeah.
So I really like that idea of not going much beyond the 5 year general plan
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and kind of being open to, what's coming up next.
That is true. I'm a planner too, and I found that I have to just let things go a lot of the
Yeah, I
times
mean,
because
2020 has taught us a lot, right?
what?
Yeah,
What? I
yeah.
don't even can't even. So my next
Be in the
segment,
moment.
exactly. Be present. Like we tell
Yeah.
women in labor, be present.
There's so many lessons of labor that I've spewed,
Yeah.
1,000 times that I've been saying to myself
Yes. Yes.
through this year,
Yeah.
stay in the
Yeah.
moment, only deal with what's right
Right
in
here.
front of you.
Exactly.
Don't try to figure out
Yeah.
what's happening
Yeah.
way in
Yeah.
the future. Yep.
My biggest
Yep.
one has been I took the neonatal resuscitation course years ago, and she said, feel your feet on the ground.
Yeah. She
And
says
that,
that a lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
been my mantra pretty much. Like
Right.
when mine starts going, I'm like, where are you? Where feel your
Yes.
feet on the ground. Okay.
And the taking pleasure in those smaller things, like really focusing in, like, I have a warm bed to sleep in with a
Yes.
lovely blanket, like
Yes.
just sit with that,
Exactly.
and I
Exactly.
say things like that in labor, like, you're in between contractions, just feel the contact between your body and the bed, feel how
Mm-hmm.
good, the weight of you feels,
Yeah.
the blanket feels, like, those hormones feel in the in between.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have a lot of those in betweens in
Yes.
the midst of the hardships of the pandemic and the things we're missing.
Yeah, we really do. That
Yeah.
that that is a good point. We really do. And my next segment is if you'd like to share your birth story.
Oh, wow. Okay. I can give a little
Yeah.
synopsis of my
Mm-hmm.
birth story. So, I was single when I had my son, and I had been on the horse farm riding horses until I was about 7 months pregnant, in which case
Oh.
my belly just couldn't fit. So
Mm-hmm.
I definitely switched to those nicer, safer
Horses.
horses. Um, and although I did actually break a horse before I
Oh.
realized I was pregnant when I was pregnant. So that's exciting.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, I left the farm and I was organizing a big conference for the city community garden organization. And I spent like that last month of my pregnancy sleeping on my friend's couch in Brooklyn so that I didn't have a long commute from Jersey into the city every
Mm-hmm.
day, organizing this conference. And it was a Thursday, my second to last day at that job. And I was sitting at my desk typing, and my water broke. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess this is it. So I had a pair of pants and an underwear in my drawer because I knew that could be a possibility. So I went to the bathroom, I cleaned myself up, I put on a pad, I took some deep breaths, and then my girlfriend Nikki, who I adore, but she is definitely a high energy, I say a
Ooh,
little
yes.
dramatic. And so I was like, okay, let me think about how I'm going to let her know, so she's calm. And so I took her into the office. I said, sit in the chair. And I'm like, Nikki, I just, I want you to come with me to take me to my sister's apartment just so I have someone with me because my water broke. Nikki fell on the floor out of her chair. Like she was so, and I was like, calm down. And here I am, the person who's actually in labor, like trying to get her
Yeah.
calm. So we took the subway to my sister's apartment, and my dad came and picked me up there in the car and went back to Jersey. And by the time we got back to Jersey, on the way there, I was feeling some contractions.
Yeah.
But my plan was to see how long I could hide it before anybody could tell
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that I was having contractions. And I was planning a home birth. My mom had her babies at home, and like this was just kind of the family norm. So I was born at home. My mother was born at home. Her dad received her. I was born at home. My dad received me. That was not planned. They had a
Mm-hmm.
midwife that never made it because the birth was so rapid. My mom was received by her father, who was a doctor.
Oh, wow.
And then at home. And then my grandmother, of course, by that generation was born at home. So, and then my son was born at home. So the home birth
Yes,
lineage has
yes.
never been
Oh,
broken
wow.
so far, in my line. But I had a boy, so who knows what
Yeah.
happens.
You could still convince her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I don't
Yes.
want to be one of those annoying, doula moms. It's autonomy,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's all up to her. Support her choices. Um, so I got there. I was kind of hiding, and my midwife came over and kind of spent a little time there. It was, I told her that I was kind of feeling contractions. It's now about like maybe, I don't know, 9 p.m. or so. Like my mom made a nice curry. We had dinner, like, and then the midwife's like, I'm going to go to bed and you should try to go to bed too. And now it's like getting later on in the night. Maybe it's like midnight, 1 a.m. And I stood up on my mom's dresser, and I just started doing some circles with my hips and stuff. And then I felt one contraction that I was just like, whoa, that's a whopper,
Yeah.
And I was not going to lay down and go to bed. So I went to the toilet and I spent the next 3.5 hours or so on that toilet. I did not budge. And they were just washing over me, like, really powerfully. And my aunt was in there and my mom was in there, the two like matriarchs of the family. And they were fanning me and just there with me. And my little cat Moochie was sitting there just kind of, watching. And like after that time, I was like, oh, I want to push. And I woke up my midwife and she said, okay, you're about 9.5 centimeters. Like it's not quite time yet. And she discouraged me from pushing, which looking back, I'm like, yeah, have done that. I was ready, he was coming. So I started bawling tears. Like, I can't, I have to push. Like, why are you telling me not to? And she's like, get in the shower. So while looking back, I wish she hadn't discouraged me.
Yeah.
The shower was actually a very good experience because my mom got in there with me. And, my mom died when my son was 3. So I didn't have much longer with her after that birth. And, she is a huge reason why I became a doula, why, I believe in women's bodies. She, from a very young age, like my mom really saw the human body as just, a body. Like nakedness was no big deal. Like it was, I was encouraged to be physical, with my body, to love the functionality of it. There was never, you should be a certain weight or, it was, you should enjoy, your body and being physical in it. And, she also gave me my love of horses. So we got in that shower and I just draped my body over her and went through the next hour. And I remember that shower making me feel like, oh, I can just do this as long as I need to. Like it no longer had this urgency to it. I was like, I'm okay in here. And I got out, and was ready to push and got on my hands and knees on the hardwood floor in front of my bed. And my dad was actually on the bed, the person who had received me when I was born. And I leaned over him and it was like this mattress on a flat frame bed. And he, I was like athlete fit when I gave birth because I was working, 12 to 14-hour days on that farm every day. And he would reach far back and grab the edge of the mattress. And I held on to him and I pushed like, roar! When I pushed, I was pulling him off the bed. So he grabbed the end of the mattress. And every time I pushed, the whole mattress was going up vertically with him, like trying to anchor himself to this. And the contraction would end. And I would just remember, like, my eyes were closed. I didn't want to see anyone. And I remember my aunt saying, you're doing it, Bonu, you're doing it. And I'm like, of course I am. Like, I don't need any encouragement. I so owned it. I was like, I don't need encouragement. Like, I know I have this. I feel where he is. And I would hear my dad say, "She's really strong. She get really strong, man."
The accent came out.
like, like trying to hold, to hold me down. It took me about an hour, and then,
Yeah.
he pushed out, and then while I was kind of bent over and my eyes were closed, like I realized my brother had come in, my cousin from another home had come in, like my sister was there. There was like a whole room full of people.
Mm-hmm.
When my son finally came out, and he was just chattering for like an hour straight, not crying, just like,
He
goo
was
goo
telling,
gaga
he was
baby
telling you
talk.
what
Like he just
happened.
had
Yeah.
a lot to say, a lot to say. And I always say, like, he hasn't shut up since. Like,
Well, I have a chatterer. So,
yeah, oh, yours beats mine. Like,
yes.
yours was the first child I met that my son Siraj, when he met Danny, he was just quiet. Like, he was just low. Like, I was like, you met your match.
Exactly.
You met your match.
Exactly.
There is
Yeah.
someone who could talk, like, even more than you.
So, what did your birth experience teach you about you?
Huh. I think I had always been so confident in my physical body.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think I've had a love affair with my body, and in part, and again, not about how I look, but in part because both of my parents really, kind of instilled that.
Yeah.
In me, and also my experience with the horses. Like, it was about, like, I can ride, I can haul hay bales and throw them. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can take a sledgehammer and break the ice in a stream for them to drink in the winter. Like, so I feel like I always had a lot of confidence in myself physically. And I think labor gave me more mental confidence because I couldn't move. I imagine I would dance my way through labor, and I parked on that toilet, and I could not move. And it was my mind, my mental fortitude that got me through those few hours of just like, I would just talk to myself the whole time. Anyone can do 90 seconds of anything. I can do this. I just have to get to the next break. Like, it's going to end. I'm going to have a baby at the end of this. And just like talking my way through it, talking my way through it, talking my way through it. And it also reaffirmed, my independence.
Yeah.
That I've always, from fifth grade, from kindergarten, I remember like, we have to do a group project. Now I'm going to do all the work, and I have to teach all of them too,
Yeah.
I've just always, I love doing a lot of things on my own. I'm someone who has a lot of friends. I'm very gregarious. I love spending time with people, but I just also love the solo stuff. And I never felt like I suffered, being a single mom. Like I've enjoyed that, Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. That was a beautiful story.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Where can people find you? Where are your handles?
Yeah. So my website is fullbirth.com, which is just about to be published, a new updated version of that. And I teach for pregnancy and parenting, which is just pregnancy and parenting, oneword.com. I also teach for Hudson River Park Mamas, which is a, kind of a giant mothers group. I do have a business page on Facebook, which is, again, Full Birth. Pretty easy to find.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. This was
My
so much
pleasure.
fun. I have never heard your birth story before.
No?
No.
I don't tell it a lot.
No.
I don't.
I think
So
we
here
need
it
to
is.
do that the next time. We need to, at our meetings, we need to have I would love to hear
Right.
everyone's
Right.
birth stories. Like,
Yeah.
we should do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.